Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring, where we are going to talk about ancestral folklore. And here with me today is Ben Stimpson. And Ben is an integrative therapist, a spiritual director, author, podcaster, and scholar of folklore and history. He's originally from North Wales, but he's lived much of his life in Ontario. Ben's academic and professional record is varied, with focuses in social work, counseling, and the humanities. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Studies, minoring in classical, medieval, and religious studies from the University of Waterloo, a diploma in spiritual psychotherapy from the Transformational Arts College, and a diploma in social service work from Humber College. He is a registered member with the British Association of Counselling. One of Ben's major interests is the intersection of storytelling and personal development, particularly the power of individual and communal narratives in our lives. Welcome, Ben.
Hello, thank you, Tracy. Wow, that sounds really good, doesn't it? I hardly ever recognize myself in that.
No, it's very impressive. So today we are going to talk about ancestral folklore, but before we start, can you tell me, have you been doing any folkloring lately?
I do on a regular basis. So where I live in Ontario, it's a little tiny town called Wyerton. And Wyerton is best known as being the home of Wyerton Willie, who is the one of the Canadian groundhogs that predicts weather in February. So Wyerton Willie actually is living in a little enclosure about 5 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. So I regularly go down there and walk by his cage, and there's a big statue. And like you can't walk anywhere in this town without coming across this figure of Wyerton Willie, this genius loci, this mascot, this wonderful little guy, or the succession, the lineage of little guys, because they've gone through quite a few in the past few decades.
It's like the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Exactly, yes. Yes. So it's interesting kind of living in this folklore landscape, because there are so many stories connected to Wyerton Willie. There are so many stories connected to people telling these stories when tourists come. We're on the road to cottage country up here, so people are like, it gets, considerably busier during the summer months here. Goes from like nobody on the road to suddenly just streams of traffic going past. And one of the big draws is Wyerton Willie. They go down to his little area, they look, they take pictures, and of course there's always the locals who are there to tell the stories. So the folkloring aspect of that is being in this landscape with this story, actually seeing the current incarnation of Wyerton Willie, and knowing that he has taken, or she, depending, they have taken over the landscape here and become as I said, the genius loci. You get a feeling, the sense that there is something bigger kind of inhabiting this space and honoring that. So that's part of my folkloring, is honoring Wyerton Willie.
That's very cool. That's really neat that you have that kind of community story that is there and present. Can you tell the difference when it's a new Willie?
Yes. Unfortunately, because I've lived in the area, like I grew up an hour and a half south, well, an hour south of here. I remember when there was a traumatic experience in the early 2000s with one of the previous Willies who had died in his hibernation. And nobody knew, nobody found out. So when it came time to seeing, if he'll come out of his cave to see his shadow, he was already long dead. And so there was this big conspiracy, and there was all these like urban legends of finding this half-rotted carcass, and all the children are crying and all of that. So then there was the big let's search and find. It was almost like the Tibetans finding the new Dalai Lama, like going out and searching for the new, because Wyerton Willie isn't just a groundhog, he's an albino groundhog. So they have to go out and find an albino groundhog to become the next Wyerton Willie. So it was really interesting that. So yeah, I've lived and grown up with this creature for a very long time. So
that's really funny that there are like conspiracy theories around it. It's like meta folklore.
Very much so. Like people got really, really angry about it because it was like, why is the mayor covering this up? You know, it's like, what really happened? Did they kill this animal? Like, what was it? You know?
Oh my God, this would make such a good story.
It's so funny. And the whole town is only like, I'd say probably about 5,000 people. It doubles and
Oh,
triples to like, 15,000 people, 20,000 people because of all the cottages in the area during the summertime. But like during the wintertime, it's only very small. So February, it's a big event. A lot of people come up for the Wyatt and Willie Festival. They have like a parade. They have, oh, it's a grand thing. So it became a really important thing to find out who killed Willie, right?
oh my God, that is really funny. I love that. As for me, I make a lot of folk medicine. I do a lot of tinctures and stuff. And I planted some spearmint because I absolutely adore spearmint.
Mhm.
But it took over, as mint is wont to do. And I have so much spearmint. So I've been gathering it for days. And I jumped online to try and figure out what am I going to do? I'm not going to make gallons of tincture. It'll take me the rest of my life to use it up. So I found some great recipes for spearmint tea.
Oh,
And I've started making that because it's got amazing health benefits,
mhm.
apparently. So that's been my little bit of folk medicine that
Wonderful.
I've been doing. And I only have the one thing because it's taken me so long. But anyway, let's get into it. Why don't you just start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your path? I laid out the professional stuff,
Mhm.
but tell us who you are and how you got to be where you are today.
Absolutely. So, as you said, I'm originally from North Wales. I came to Canada when I was a child. I'm in preparation to actually move back to the UK. And so folklore and folk life is a really important part of kind of my professional academic work, but also, oh, I can't say professional academic work, my academic work, but also part of my life as well. One of the things when I came over here, because British television in the 90s was so saturated with stories of King Arthur and the fairies and the last unicorn, for example, right? So it was a very, very folklore and legend heavy kind of lifestyle. So I always really connected with that because it was part of my heritage, part of my culture, part of how I grew up, right? And that was a real bonding piece for me to reconnect with back home. You know, I dealt with a lot of culture shock when I came over here. And so anything that was connecting me with back home with that sense of normality was a big thing for me. And then it just continued. I just fell in love with folklore and folk story and legend, and that became a big part of kind of my interest in paganism and magic. That really jump started that for me. And then eventually it also seeped into my kind of helping profession work. So I started LARPing, I started playing like RPGs and of course living that experience. I could see the psychological benefits, psychotherapeutic benefits, but also the spiritual benefits. What really clinched it for me was starting to work with a spiritual group up here. And it was a very large group. There was about 150 people connected to it. And they did living myth work. So they took Joseph Campbell's work and they constructed weekend events where we would engage with living sacred mystery traditions in that way by
Oh,
putting on,
cool.
oh, it was amazing. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And so then that really brought in that idea of living a story entering and taking down the fourth wall and entering into a story. And then that connection with landscape. And when I started to really look at it that way, I started to realize, well, folklore is essentially always tied to landscape, whether we like it or not. It's just an element of our psychology that we will continually associate with landscape stories
Right,
and connections. Like I was saying about Wyatt and Willie, right?
right.
If I go around town here, that's Wyatt and Willie's pen. That's where he lives. That's the statue of Wyatt and Willie. That's where, there's a whole sacred landscape connected to this little rodents, right? And we just naturally do it. It's a way that our psychology naturally associates and organizes our world through the use of symbol, through the use of association, through the use of spatial dynamics. And
Right.
so it just kind of all came together for me. So really in the past 6, 7 years, I've been really deeply exploring that. And of course, during the pandemic, I started writing books. So I came out with my first book last year, Ancestral Whispers, and we'll get into that.
Yep.
So that authorship piece, again, connecting with story, connecting with landscape, and connecting with people and figures and spirits really came into that ancestral work for me. So I'm an author, I'm a therapist. I just finished doing medieval studies and classical studies at Waterloo. So I'm also a researcher as well, amateur. Well, not amateur. I'm graduated, but I'm not professionally doing it yet. But that's
Yep.
also part of my life too. So folklore and folklorist is something I add to my wheelbarrow too. So I hope that answers the question. I don't even know how to answer that question nowadays, to be honest.
I think that was a great answer. It gives us a little insight into who you are. Can you give us just the broad overview of your book?
Yes, of course.
Because I think it's a great book. I
Thank you.
enjoyed it immensely, and I think it would be of interest.
Of course. So, and thank you for reading it. I was really pleased by that. So the book was essentially designed to be a guidebook for people who were not connected with a spiritual tradition that had ancestor veneration as part of it. So it's a guidebook to essentially asking the right questions. It's split into two sections. The first section is the thinky bit, is the worldview bit. I basically outline all the different types of ways to see peoplehood, personhood. Can get a little bit into philosophy there, right? Because really that question of who of the dead is connected to that question of who of the living, right? What makes us living people, persons, right? And then
Right.
how do we then decide what the dead are and who the dead are and what their identity is, where they dwell, the whole thing of how we conceptualize ancestors. So the thinky bit is going through those components, getting really people to think about their own cultural and individual understanding of who these spirits are, who these beings are.
Mhm.
The second component is then how do you build a living practice around working with these beings, right? For me, it's really important that ritual flows from worldview, because if you're not do if your worldview is that the ancestors on a metaphysical level dwell in the ground, then why put offerings up high where they can't get to it,
Right.
right? And when you look at most cultures around the world, ritual flows from worldview, right? You know, there's always logic connected to ritual, even as if outsiders don't get it because they don't understand that worldview, right?
Yeah, for me, the second half was the most exciting half because like the whole time I'm reading, I'm thinking this is all folkloring. This
Yeah,
is what folkloring is.
exactly.
And it was so interesting to look at the ways in which you give people the tools
Yes.
in order to develop their practices,
Mhm.
whether they're drawing on, their culture
Mhm.
or their family or just things that have appealed to them that they're drawn to.
Yeah,
And I loved that bit because it isn't like so many other books of this nature. It's not, here's a bunch of rituals you can do. Here's some spells. Here's whatever it is. It is helping people figure out for themselves
exactly.
how to make it. And I always say, anyone
Mhm.
who's listened to me at all will have heard me say, I think that every religion is a religion of one
Mhm.
because you can take all of the practices, everything that you have, but it's going to be seen through the prism of your lived experience.
This is it. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so giving people those tools is really it's meaningful. And it was particularly interesting for me because when I was growing up, we were not really very connected to extended family.
Mm.
And my mother didn't like my father's mother, and so we didn't see that side of the family a lot. She was like her family was far away, so we rarely saw them. So it just wasn't, it never felt like there was a larger family unit around me. It's gotten better as I've gotten older.
Mm.
Interestingly, I talk regularly to some of my cousins now.
Right.
And, we've built that back up. But yeah, and I don't have, like, except for my one grandmother, all of my grandparents had passed before I was born.
Right. Right.
So yes, I didn't really have that experience of having elders in my life. So that it's been very interesting to go through the book and sort of say, wait, I can have those elders. And of course,
Absolutely.
I found people over the years who were, parental figures and all of that, in addition to my parents. But I like that, and I want to get into that in a little bit.
Of course, definitely. Well, can I say something on that piece?
Please.
This is a really, really crucial, important piece here, right? We see this with folklore and culture in general. 150 years ago, 100 years ago, Western culture, particularly North America and in Europe, right, shifted, right? A lot of people were displaced, a lot of people migrated, a lot of people, like traditional family life, and they don't say traditional family life as in, like how the evangelical Christians will want you, but like traditional society, right? Where we
Right.
had the village people, we had very close-knit communities. Families generally were close enough to each other that they would know each other and they interact quite frequently. They constituted the matrix of folk culture. And then suddenly we had about 200 years ago, starting really with the Industrial Revolution, people started migrating away, going finding work, and so that folk culture started to break down. With it
Right.
also broke down the family ties, the community ties, and so then all of those rituals that were shared in that cultural matrix began to break down. And so now we have a lot of people who don't know what their family traditions are because they don't have connection with family, right?
Right.
They're trying to refine it, but often what happens, and this is where it was very intentional in the book, not to give things for people to do
Mm-hmm.
because people are yearning to do something. But if you're taking something from somebody else, it won't really create the relationship with you and your ancestors. And that's the big word of the book is relationship. Relationship
Mm-hmm.
to self, relationship to ancestors, relationship to community, and relationship to the community to you, right?
Right.
So it's very, very important for me not to do that. And people have a genuine yearning for this. Unfortunately, what happens is that idea of cultural appropriation comes in. There are communities out there that have continued and thrived or have continued their communal connections and all of the rituals and the way of life and all of the relationships within that. We see this with movie Coco, for example, a really good example of this, right? You have the spiritual tradition of the Day of the Dead, you have the family celebrating that Day of the Dead, and then you have the extended dead family coming in and celebrating with that family through these rituals.
Right.
When you look at the ritual makes logical sense to that cultural context and the relationships between those dead and living people, because those dead people celebrated the exact same rituals, right?
Right. Right.
And this is the essence of folk culture to me. That's the continuation. Families or communities, even if they're not related by blood, are continuing and perpetuating the same traditions over and over again and create that ancestral lineage and line, right? So I would say that ancestral work in general is folk culture in general.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, soapbox moment.
It's very interesting. Now, it sort of leads me to my next question about the spiritual tradition that you practice.
Yes.
So it's called the Lakumi. Is that, am
Yes,
I?
the Lukumi tradition. Yes. So
Yeah.
um,
How did you come to that? And what is, tell us what you can about it.
yeah, of course, definitely. So I'm not as connected with it anymore as I used to be. In 2017, I met my godfather, and so Lukumi is an Afro-Cuban branch of a greater tradition that is connected to the Nigerian Yoruba tradition. So these are the Orishas. The Orishas are the kind of the spirits that dwell in the landscape, and are kind of emissaries from God.
Okay.
And oftentimes in the Lukumi tradition, there are priests who are become the living embodiments of those spirits. They become crowned, and then they lead the celebrations and lead the kind of the rituals in a family structure. So you become part of an ile, which is a family god family, basically within
Okay.
that tradition, and then your priest will engage the rituals for you, create the opportunity for you connect with the spirits, and eventually maybe you initiate, maybe you don't initiate, but it's one of those community things, right? So I became involved in 2017 through my boyfriend, but then I ended up becoming a roommate of my godfather, and I lived with them for a few years. It's an animistic tradition, ultimately. So a big focus is on healing. And one of the big core pieces is ancestral work. So we have a saying in Lukumi, ancestors beneath us, Orishas around us, God above us, right? We're then centralized in that cocoon of the spiritual nature. So I became involved. I began to feel like with the ancestor work, because it was couched very much in that very specific Cuban tradition and Yoruba tradition, I found that it worked for me, but where were my ancestors in that? And I was encouraged to begin to explore relationships through cultural rituals and other kind of cultural symbols with my own relatives, as well as the kind of the tradition ancestors. So I began to then explore that on my own, and I had some amazing experiences through that framework, and it really I built my practice off of it. A big part of it is ancestral work every day, not just at Samhain or certain times of the year. Another big piece is communicating with them. So there's divination, direct divination. And that's a big piece. They're not just archetypes, they're not just kind of there or off in some afterlife somewhere inaccessible. They are here all the time with their hands capable of being involved in our lives. And I felt that for myself. So over the span of a few years, I really connected with my ancestors again. I had a framework for that. Another piece to that is a spiritismo, which is the Caribbean form of spiritism, Kardecian spiritism. And that actually has a lot of connections and very many similarities to cunning folk tradition. So the cunning folk tradition from Europe, in the same way that brujos or curanderas in Mexico or South America have a very similar sort of function in society.
Interesting.
Yeah, so did that answer the question?
Yeah, it really does seem like everything in your life kind of coalesced for you to be able to write this book. Yeah, I can see all of these things you're talking about in the book. And if any of our listeners are interested, you can find the book on Amazon.
Amazon, you can go to independent bookstores as well. I'm a big fan of that. You can go straight directly to the Llewellyn website and order through them directly, which I'm also a fan of. So yeah, there are many ways to find it.
Great. Okay, so let's talk about the ancestors. Who are our ancestors, the ancestors? What is this expanded view of how we can connect and feel like we are doing ancestral work?
Yes. So I'm a big fan of seeing ancestors as expanded concept. You know, a lot of times in the West, we tend to only think of ancestors as biological, directly related to us ancestors. But there are many, many other forms of ancestor. I define it basically as any being or any person who has impacted who we are, whether that be biological ancestors have given us life, physical life, whether that be lineage ancestors who have contributed to what we do. So we see this a lot in lineages, spiritual lineages, or academic or professional lineages, right? The people who came before us and created the context that we live in now. I'm also a big fan of kind of more abstract form of ancestors. So being from North Wales, but not having dwelled in North Wales for a very, very long time, the land of North Wales itself is an ancestor to me because certain parts of my body originated there. The physical parts, like the atoms, the molecules were at one time part of North Wales and then came into me. I was born there. I have a spiritual connection to that place. And so in many ways, it has become an ancestor to me. The whole land of the UK is an ancestor to me. And then, expanding out and out, the whole world is an ancestor to us. The whole universe is an ancestor to us, right?
Right.
So working with the ancestors is essentially relationship. It's, not using them. And I hate that word ancestral magic. I can't stand ancestral magic because it always feels like you're using these beings to get to something. relationship is building relationship, and part of that building of relationship is doing things. So, just as you would with any family or friends, you would go and visit them in the same way that in ancestral work you go and visit them. So whether that's setting up a shrine where they can have a space in your home that you can go to and communicate with them, or actually going on pilgrimage, going to the places that once belonged or that they dwelled in, and experiencing that place for yourself, building a connection to them through that removing of the fourth wall, right? Engaging in activities that have been handed down. I think a lot of people do this and they don't realize. People do ancestor work, people do necromancy without realizing what they're doing. Whenever you make a family recipe, love that that trend of placing recipes on tombstones. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
No, so it's become a bigger trend. If you Google it, there's like cookbooks that people put together. There's a TikToker who went around and actually like found these recipes and made like does videos of making them. But it's that last will and legacy piece, right? This is Auntie Floris's famous old recipe or whatnot, or this is the cake that your grandmother used to make, right? And it's on the tombstones. People are then making it and ingesting it and having that same experience as those dead people, and in a way those dead people are also experiencing it through you too, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm very fascinated by grave goods in general and the things that people leave. And I think it happens a lot with children when children pass, because it's, unfortunate that they pass young. And so it's like the toys and the things that would make the child happy. But yeah, I think that it's so cool that they're doing that with the recipes, because cooking is one of those things, like food is love, right? And it's an expression of the connection that you have with other people. And we talk about breaking bread and how important it is, and many of the offerings we leave for those that leave offerings are food based, and a lot of people use them in ritual work. Even, body and blood of Christ. It's all traditions. I think that food is such an important part. So being able to share those recipes is, I remember when my mother handed down her favorite cookbook to me, such a powerful kind of thing. And it was, for her, she of course gave it to me and not my brother, because
of course. Right.
But barring that little dark part of the story, it was, I was like, but you still cook, what? And she's like, I don't need it anymore,
Right. That's an honoring thing though, isn't it? That's an honoring thing. Yeah,
very much so. And it had all her little notes in it of the special things that she did. It was not as moving and powerful as when she gave me her 150-year-old cast iron pan. So food offerings is, and that's really neat that other people can go see it and say,
well, and that's the thing. Yeah, exactly. This is part of the legacy piece, right? It's that idea. So let's look at what's really happening with that. This really gets to the core of the book as well. So the ancestral work that I teach in my book, and many of the other people talking about ancestral work, it's not about mourning, right? People often confuse that. They think that mourning is ancestral work. No, mourning is actually you're dealing with a death, your kind of trauma of that, right? That's what mourning traditions basically are. They are rituals, completion to bring society back into a new sense of balance and normal after having a loss, right? What mourning traditions often have done to us, especially in the West, is remove the ancestors to some other place. They're no longer here. Right. When we think of even the language that we speak about the dead in the past tense. We tend to think of the dead in their past tense, right? We don't think of them as now, as being capable of being here with us now, because we don't see them with our five senses, right? Ancestor tradition and ancestral practice is about recognizing that they are very much real now. They might not be in the same physicality as us, but they have the opportunity to continue on after death, right? And so what does the food offerings do? What does building the shrine do? What does going on pilgrimage do? What does living this practice do? It removes the fourth wall within safe means, right? Every tradition has its own kind of safety around what is the actual borderline between life and death, right? Very important.
Right.
But it does create that space of connection, that space of that third space of encounter, right? When you're eating food that comes from your mom's cookbook, especially if she's passed, right? You're having the same sensations that she did.
Right.
When you touch something that an ancestor or somebody that you respected also touched, you're experiencing the physicality of that piece in the same way that they might have done. It creates that creates a border meeting encounter space, right? Right. And so it's I think that's why people love heirlooms, is because there's a connection there, right? In a way that mourning traditions won't. I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and the woman was of Jewish background. We were just talking about this piece, and I said I made the case to her that the main difference between mourning and ancestor veneration is mourning, you would be sitting Shiva for 40 years, right? This is ancestor work, which is embracing both the new kind of life without that person physicality, but also recognizing that they're still there. And she was like, I get it. Yeah, how horrible it would be to sit Shiva for 40 years, right?
Oh my God. Yeah.
Right?
Right. So can you expand a little bit on what ancestor veneration looks like?
That depends on the person, right? So ancestor veneration, again, it is built on that idea of relationship. It's based on that idea of recognizing them in the world now. For some, it can be actually having a physical shrine where you can go and encounter them, where you have that space set up, and it's a space of communion and connection. For others, it's going to the cemetery instead, right? Affirming that boundary between life and death. The dead have their space, we have our space, we go to that middle ground to meet them, right? And so ancestor veneration can be going during the Day of the Dead and decorating the grave and offering food and libations, right?
Right.
Another piece is the yearly rituals, perhaps sometimes. So if you look at, Hinduism, Pitru Paksha, that month that time just after the last harvest, where the dead are believed to come into the home. So the home is then decorated and made to be fit for them because they're temporarily in the space. There are safeguards put in place to make sure everybody is not arguing and everything is fine, right? And then after that, they're sent away or they return to where they came from. Another piece I think a lot of people do without realizing it is communicating. So praying to them, speaking to them, writing down letters, right? That piece is really strong. And that's ancestor veneration. Engaging in the rituals of the community and perpetuating them is also a really big piece of ancestor work. Right. If we look at it from that, whenever you engage or you continue folk traditions, because you want to preserve those folk traditions, you're preserving the matrix that was also preserved by every single ancestor behind you doing the same thing. Even if the folk tradition changes and organically evolves, you're still taking part in that continuation. For others, it can be actually warding against them. So making sure that the affirmation between life and death is affirmed, that, doing that deep work of making sure that the physical space is safe, that the spiritual space is safe. What is very common in the West that you don't necessarily see in the East or other parts of the world is the psychological aspect, right? So the family work, the psychotherapeutic piece is ancestor work. A lot of that has really taken over the discourse around ancestor work in the West, I've found, is that idea of ancestral healing, right? And I mean, I'm not knocking it. I'm a therapist myself, but I think that can often take us in the same direction of that Protestant mindset of, oh, well, it's just not real. It's all in our heads. Like we have to be the focus of it. That individualism becomes a big thing. And I talk about that in the book too, the downsides of that. But
yeah, I think that it's a very Western thing to think, oh, I need to fix this, and so it's like we're gonna heal those ancestral wounds. right? And people talk about that like it stops with me and I'm not going to pass that down to my kids. And I think that in a lot of ways, just the process of growing up, you're going to have, different things happen that will shape who you are. And some of them will be negative. That is the nature of growing up, because we have to figure out that there are other people outside of us and that they have their needs. And it's, and in each stage as children, we go, wait a minute, it was way better when everything was all about me.
Right.
And so I don't think it's possible to avoid getting wounded. I think people should absolutely work on making themselves better and as healthy as they can, and recognize things that, if your parents were doing the best they could, and not do them again if they were particularly painful to you. But the process never ends. You are always going to, you will peel back and find a new layer, and then you'll have to work on that. And it's very cyclical. You say, okay, I worked on this, I'm good. And then, a year later, you find yourself doing the same thing. So I think what you said about the ongoing practice of ancestral work, and it has to, you talk about it has to be a regular thing. You have to engage in it all the time. And I think that it's like any other practice of what you have to, you don't meditate once a year. You don't work out once a month. You have to keep up with, your physical, spiritual, mental. You have to work on it all the time. So, and I see what you're saying about how the different belief systems about what the ancestors look like, have they gone off to heaven and they're just there and looking down on us, but there is no communication that can come back to us. That's, one way, like we can talk to them, they can hear us. Or if you think that they're here and kind of hanging out, but we just can't hear their communication, that's going to look different. Then you're going to say, well, maybe I will go to a medium, or maybe I will, do some divination for myself and see. So I think that it is really interesting how it impacts how you communicate with the ancestors. Yeah.
Very much so.
So when, there's a lot of different types of ancestral relationships that you talked about, right? Our actual physical heritage and different. So how do we decide who we're going to communicate to? How do we get to a point where we know this is what I'm going to do every day for ancestral work?
This is where it becomes difficult, as people who either are not interested in the cultural traditions that already exist, or those cultural traditions have degraded so much in the past 200 years, 100 years, I should say, that we're trying to refine things, right? So it really depends on the individual. I can talk about my own. I think that would probably be a good tact with this. So for me, I'm not a Christian, but I recognize the role of Christianity in my shared culture with all of my biological ancestors, my cultural ancestors, my lineage ancestors. And many of those figures are actually ancestral to the landscape and to the culture. So something I've been really diving into is working with saints, and particularly working with saints of the landscape of the UK. So, where in North Wales I come from, about 20 minutes away is a place called Holywell, and Holywell is holy well, and it's the holy well of Saint Winifred, who is a local saint from North Wales. She was the daughter of a Roman, and she wanted to convert to Christianity, but her father wanted her to marry. Very typical martyr story, very typical saint story. So she was killed. And from where she died, a sacred well came up. And so now her healing waters have been a huge part of Welsh culture for centuries, the past 1,500 years. That place is very central to the landscape, and it's very central to the sacred landscape. So pilgrimages to that space, even if you're not Catholic, even if you're not Christian, is a really important part. And a lot of people from outside of the UK have gone there to seek. It's kind of like the Welsh lords, basically. So working with this figure of Saint Winifred this healing figure of Saint Winifred as for my own healing has become a big thing for me, because she's one of the local gals, right? She's our Winifred. She's our Saint Winifred, right?
Right.
In the same way that St. Colin, for example, connected in with Glastonbury because of the story of St. Colin and Gwyneth Neath, right? Landed in the landscape. This is like, you can walk around the streets of Glastonbury and imagine that this saint is connecting in with this fairy king. And you can just imagine you're in that same space as that. And so in that way, I'm connecting both with the landscape as ancestor, but also the figures as ancestor. Another big thing for me is really working with my lineage ancestors, the people who have inspired my practice. So Madame Blavatsky, for example, has had a theosophy, has had a huge impact on Western esoteric traditions. Same with Uncle Al, right? Uncle Aleister Crowley, right? I might not like them necessarily as people, but in honoring them, because of their impact on the world that I live in now, I feel a sense of empowerment through that, a sense of being chugged on. And when you look at other traditions around the world, I think particularly of, say, Venezuelan Espiritismo, right? What you have is a spiritual tradition built with all sorts of different figures involved. And all of those figures represent the people of Venezuela, which is a very mixed, diverse group of people, right? But when they see their pantheon of spirits, they have Vikings as part of their spiritual courts, right? They have courts of like deceased physicians, of like, really important people in their cultural view. They can recognize themselves in that. So for me, my personal ancestral practice is really merging with my spiritual practice in general, and really connecting in with these figures. And through those relationships, and connecting in with my own practice and being part of the chain of existence. I'm, I've just written another book. I know we'll talk about that on another podcast, but
Yes.
the whole book is around witches and cunning folk and magicians from a folkloric stance. When I'm looking through these stories, some of them were from areas that my parents came from, Yorkshire and Lancashire. And when I am reading the stories of them from 150 years ago, 200 years ago, what I'm sensing from the stories is the same humor that is involved in my family. Like, I could almost hear my grandmother like speaking like that, or my mum, or like little catchphrases that only Northerners know, right? And just the whole sense of it, I felt so connected in with this cultural kind of river and flow. Knowing that I'm part of that, even though I didn't grow up directly within that kind of area or that culture, I'm still connected in with that. And in that way, I built relationships with some of these people, right? So I think for me, it's that relationship is a really big thing. From that relationship then comes actual practice, like going to St. Winifred's well, collecting her holy water, using that holy water in my healing practices.
Right.
In the same way that, in town here, connecting in with the genius loci that is Wyerton Willie, knowing that this is his domain, he's here, and there's a sense maybe that he's based on something else, that maybe there was another spirit that existed here from indigenous times, that took on the mask of Wyerton Willie, and through that, then that idea of prophecy.
Right.
Wyerton Willie is a spirit of prophecy, and so I feel like my prophetic skills are more attuned in this space because of that, right?
Yeah, I think your experience is really great to hear about, because you made a major relocation in your life, and you were young enough that you connected as a child as well to the area that you still live in. And so you've got that experience that so many of us have of, when we move and we experience something that's completely different than where, our origin location. And you start to bring all of that stuff in. It's like we were talking earlier, your lived experience is what is informing how your practice works. And I think that you're a perfect example of it.
Thank you. Well, I'm one of many people. Like, I hear you say that, but I think it's really important to acknowledge a lot of people, most of people do something like this, but because the label isn't ancestor veneration or the label isn't spiritual practice, right? They might not recognize it in that way. You know, I mean, looking around our homes, how many of us have pictures of our dead on the walls? How many of us have heirlooms or church keys connected to important parts of our lives?
Exactly.
And those pieces become important. And then when they're heirlooms to hand down, it's like, what new meaning and connection is created because of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, my cast iron pan has already been promised to my nephew because he comes over and I've been teaching him how to cook.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, and so it was, you know, and I'll find other things for my nieces, but it just was a natural there because we have that experience together. And we used that pan together while he was learning how to make different things.
Yeah.
And so that's a new story that will come up for that object. And I think that, you know, you're right. We do it all the time. And
Do it all the time.
it's just, I think, really in reading your book and of all the times I exclaimed to myself, that's folkloring right there. I think it's about being mindful and not just saying, I want to remember my parents, but saying they're still part of my life. They're still part of me.
Yeah.
And so I guess that brings me to the idea you were talking about Willie as a genus loci, right? And so you go through a lot of different kinds of spirits that are not just, you know, it's my mother who's on the other side. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of the different types of spirits that people can be aware of and think about?
Totally. So it's such a big list. This is the thing.
Yeah.
It's concentric circles from what we're used to, right? So we're used to seeing, because of the Western kind of mindset of, you know, your biological relationship is more important. Then maybe you're adopted, you know, if you're adopted, that causes issues for you, right? But if we start to look at kind of outside of that, we have everything from the landscapes that we exist within. We're looking at some of the folklore of the legendary ancestors. So, you know, in many places in Europe and actually around the world, right? You have these stories of communities or families that have a mythological or legendary ancestor, like the devil or Melusine, or in Wales, there's the Llyn Fanfach, the physicians of Midbai, who have a fairy as one of their progenitors. You know, in northern the North Sea, a lot of communities have seal folk as ancestors, right?
Right.
All of these different ancestors, right? Now, whether we just see them as story, fable, whatever, or something more than that, it adds to identity, right?
Right.
We have lineage ancestors, right? We have these people who are, you know, the precursors in our professions, spiritual lineages, our initiators, right? We have community members. So this is something that I would say in North America is and colonized lands is an issue, more of an issue than if we were to look at kind of older Western countries like Europe, where founders often, like towns and villages and cities often were founded by mythological founders. Same thing can be true for many North American or Australian or colonized lands, where a founder like Paul Bunyan, for example, founded this town and so forth, right? Oftentimes those founders become genius loci of those new settlements. That's how I've often experienced them. A lot of them take on folkloric and legendary status. A lot of them probably were not great people in life, right? They came and killed many natives to claim that land. But that piece of ancestry can also be kind of looked at as ancestor work and as ancestors, right? Ancestors of the community. We also have geography, right? We've talked about land, but what about the sea, right? If we see the sea as an ancestor, literally our species emerged from the sea billions of years ago, right? Life emerged from the sea. And so in a metaphysical sense, yes, many of us have, especially in the pagan sphere, deities of the sea. But what if we saw the actual sea as a progenitor? How would we work with the sea? What would it be like to go into those waters and come out of those waters, right? taking that even further, what the sky, right? We know that our barren rock of a planet, when it was forming, had tons of meteorites with water, dumped on in order to create that sea that we eventually evolved in, right? So looking at the whole universe, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right?
Right.
Ancestors of community is a big one for me, coming from the queer community, particularly those individuals who are chosen family to me, but also their chosen family, those figures who have fought for our rights in the community, Harvey Milk, for example, so many different types. We then get into questions around like other deities and figures like that, all fathers, all mothers, right?
Right.
What is the distinction between religion in that sense and then ancestor veneration? If you're worshipping an all mother or an all father, right? What is the like, in what way is that different for you? That becomes then questions of worldview. But every time you go into church, right? Every time you go in, if you're a Christian, every time you go into church and you're in your father's house, is that not ancestor veneration, right?
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. Big questions.
Yeah, definitely. I also did want to ask you when we start to look at, and you got me thinking about cryptids when you were talking and thinking like that's interesting because those are usually very local. There's a couple like Bigfoot you see all over the place, but a lot of them are just very sort of based in a very local place, and that story grows around that, and you kind of get that from the community, just like Willie, right? Like everybody, like I would have never known of the albino groundhog, right?
Right.
Just not not part of my awareness. And you can't love something that you don't know exists, right?
This is the thing, exactly.
And so I think that that's really interesting. But when I look at the traditional view of spirits, they're hanging out at the graveyard or they're at the place where there was a horrible accident and they died. But I feel like so many of them that are, like the scary stories of, trying to lure someone into the sea or whatever it is. Why are so many of those female?
This is the interesting thing, and this is a cross-cultural phenomenon. So the big question is, why are there so many of them female, right? I think that there's many answers to that. I think what we can look at is the danger pieces there, right? So, of course, traditionally, childbirth in particular posed much more of a greater threat to women than men, obviously, right?
Right.
And because every single time somebody in pre-modern times, and even nowadays, right, there are many countries around the world where childcare is not or issues of childbirth continue,
Right.
right? It's always a risk, right? And so then that question of what is the metaphysics of that, and that's a worldview thing. I think that speaks to patriarchy. I do think it speaks to when you look at that border zone between life and death, right? In the process of birthing life, suddenly the mother dies and takes the baby with her, right?
Yeah.
Or the baby is stillborn, coming from a place that is supposed to be life-giving, right? What is the
Right.
metaphysics of that, right? I think that in a way that has evolved in different societies. And of course, not all women are capable of having births. Not all women have vaginas, right? Keeping that in mind too.
Right.
But I think that's where the mourning piece comes in. You often see that the terrifying creatures or the ghosts often are female. And that's a way of warding against them, controlling them, kind of deciding like what happened here, trying to understand what happened here, but also guard against that not happening again. Right.
Right. Yeah. You see like a figure like La Llorona.
La Llorona, yes.
Yeah. And, that to me is like a cautionary tale for women. Like you will become a monster if, and it is that's always seemed like a very controlling kind of piece, or even a story like Medusa, right?
Right.
She was assaulted and, then she got a way to protect herself and got killed
Yeah.
for it. And so it is about controlling, I think, in some cases, controlling the wildness of
Very
women.
much so, very much so.
know.
And conversely, we have many surviving narratives, which makes this a complex question, because many of these surviving narratives, or these narratives that were allowed to flourish in patriarchal societies, were of course taken differently between women and male viewers, right? The story of Melusine, for example, the water demon who, and putting in inverted quotas, so people know that, the water spirit who gave birth to a whole dynasty, but because she had her privacy invaded in, her wishes were not fulfilled, she then becomes demonized. She then flies out the window and is never seen again. She becomes the evil one, right?
Yep.
And yet within that telling, there is that element of that power of vengeance comes from the female side, and it then flows through all of her descendants who are kings and nobles and whatnot, right? So it's an interesting thing.
Right.
It really does tell us a lot about cultural lenses when we see some of these stories, right? Many of these things.
Right. I always have to laugh about the story of Lilith, who, she just didn't want to be subservient and didn't see the need. And so she's kicked out of paradise. And I'm thinking, she's probably out there living her best life.
Right.
She doesn't care that she's not with Adam anymore. But anyway, okay, so let's shift a little bit and look at some symbolism and how can people use symbolism in their day-to-day practice? How can they find it around them? And how do they, interact and be mindful of what the symbolism that they create or that exists around them?
Well, an easy answer to that is that symbolism is everywhere, because that's all, like, our entire world is symbolic. Right? We ascribe symbol and meaning to everything, and literally our brains have developed in that way. So it's important. The question is more, how do we recognize symbols than find symbols, because they're everywhere. One of the biggest pieces to that is to understand our cultural understanding of those symbols. A lot of people will say, "Oh, can you interpret dream for me? Can you interpret an omen for me?" And I was having a conversation with another well-known pagan author about this, and he was saying he hates when people ask him that, because it's not our duty to interpret for anybody. The most important piece for symbols is that we understand our relationship to those symbols and the meanings that come. Now, that being said, what function do symbols have in our world? Well, they allow us to create an image of the world, first of all, but they also allow us to communicate, and that's the take I take in the book, right? So people will say, do I need to have this in my shrine? Do I need to have that in my shrine? When you look at kind of the use of symbol in religious or spiritual ritual and tradition, everything has a meaning. Nothing is in a shrine if it doesn't have a meaning. And unfortunately, we in the West, I think people who are trying to build something for themselves often mistake that. They think, oh, aesthetics are more important. Well, no, aesthetics are important, but they're also meaningful. So I'll give you an example. In the Lukumi tradition, the spirits, the Orishas, each are color-coded. They have particular colors connected with them. So their priests or priestesses wear those colors in official functions to denote that they are connected to those spirits. When we have gatherings, the spirits themselves are housed in clay pots. Those are the living embodiments of those spirits. That's where they are believed to dwell, where they exist, right? Those are the seats. They're very similar to Hindu murtis or ancient statuaries or whatnot, right? That's a pseudo form of geography, because the more traditional ancient form is that spirits and deities were connected to landscape features. The mountain of like the mountain god, and he's the mountain of this particular mountain. Originally, he was that mountain, right?
Yeah.
So in these ceremonies, the shrines are built, they're color coordinated, and so you'll see these beautiful flowing arches and these beautiful flowing thrones filled with color, and they are designated symbolically based on hierarchy, based on the relationships between those spirits, based on the relationships between us and them. So when people build altars now or shrines now to their spirits, it isn't just about making a pretty space, it's about creating a space that is communicative to those spirits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to us. So what often might happen is that you are building a pseudo-geography, a meta-geography within that space, right? If you believe that, your deity or your spirit is connected with a mountain, you might have a stone from that mountain there. Or if they're from a certain place, you might have some kind of heirloom of that place in that space to represent that greater space. You might have them connected with kind of cosmological elements. So you might situate the shrine in a particular corner of the room or corner of the house, because that's the symbolic direction that they exist within, right? So the connection between symbol then is really the connection between the meaning and the greater cosmology. That's how I like to think of it, right?
So when people are going about creating a sacred space, mm-hmm. Are there, if they're drawing on their experience, but so many times people are like, well, I want to make sure I do it right.
Mm-hmm.
So what should people think about? Like you ask a lot of really great questions in the book of how do I develop this for myself? So what questions can people ask themselves when they are creating sacred space for themselves?
Really the who, what, where, why, and how, right? Mm-hmm. So the questions are, how is whatever you're doing fitting with your worldview? Mm-hmm. Who is it directed to, and how would they feel about this space, mm-hmm. right? Because it's not just for us. And I think that's the Western Protestant mindset that a lot of people in the West who are involved in alternative spiritualities still have, is that sense of needing to be orthodox, needing to have orthoprax, right? Right way of doing it.
Right.
Because if we're taught constantly in the culture that there's only one right way because of monotheism, right? Right? Well, there are right ways, right? So with that particular spirit that you're working with, or that pantheon, or those beings, whoever, right? You're creating that space for them and for you. So the right way is to think about the metaphysics of it. What are you communicating through this? Somebody a few years ago, and I can't remember who it was now, but a few years ago, somebody built a ancestor shrine, and particularly towards their Black ancestors, African-American ancestors. They identified as white, but these were their ancestors from 3 or 4 generations ago. They also included a Dixie flag in that arrangement, because most of those were from the southern states. Mm-hmm. And people were really, really shocked by that. And they said, well, no, from a cultural point of view, this Dixie flag it's a cultural thing for me. And then people had to ask, well, how would those people who were your Black ancestors look at that Dixie flag if they lived during the time of the Confederacy,
right,
and see that? And how would that, like, what are you communicating with that then? For him, it was, oh, well, I'm just making it look pretty. And no, so those questions are really important, right? Mm-hmm. Think about the ancestors of the beings, of the spirits that you're working with. What are the elements that you're putting into this? What is that going to, communicate to them? How is that embodying it? I think also metaphysics needs to come into this, mm-hmm. because when you do something spiritual or ritual, right, it isn't just symbolic, it isn't just archetypal, at least that's how I see it.
Right.
It is literally a meta universe that you're building there. It is a slice of the universe, the greater expanse in that space.
Right.
What you do in that space then will have, reflection to the rest of the world. So it becomes a space of power. Mm-hmm. So then you have to be very intentional with what you're doing. And so those are the types of questions I would be asking, right?
Yeah, I think that the part about not only what are you trying to communicate, mm-hmm. but mm-hmm. who's hearing it? And
yes,
what is their lens through which they'd be hearing it? I mean, I think that like a Confederate flag it's mm-hmm. a dog whistle. It's not about culture. It isn't. It's gotten bigger than that. It's like
yes.
the swastika. It means something to us now that it didn't mean to ancient peoples, but it means that now. And I think, and it would mean it even a lot more, viscerally to someone who lived through the war and, someone who has a Jewish heritage. It's queer people. it says that, and you have to be cognizant of how it will be heard. And I think that that's
and how received.
Yeah.
It's really important. And I mentioned this in the book. This is one of my core memories when it comes to this. 8 years ago, I was sat around a campfire, and a member of the community I was working with, the mythopoetic community I was working with, she was talking about how she's got both Irish and Anishinaabe, Aboriginal Indigenous heritage. And she said she has to be very, very conscious of her use of alcohol in her rituals.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, the Irish side, alcohol is a community affirming substance. It brings the whole community together. It creates connection, relationship. And so for her Irish ancestors, send them the whiskey, send them the rum, right?
Right.
But for her Anishinaabe ancestors, it's poison. And so she said she had to be very deliberate and very pulse on, finger on the pulse in order to know when was it appropriate to offer libation, when was it definitely not appropriate, who is she connecting with, what is the space, what is the ritual that she's performing, right? And that was a really key moment for me to begin to understand all of this, because it's like, shit, yeah, wow, yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. So
let's explore the idea of healthy versus unhealthy sacrifice a little bit more, because I think it's important. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm, putting out a sacrifice, and they've read, oh, milk is for this kind of spirit or whatever it is. How do people offer sacrifices in a healthy way?
Of course. So first of all, understanding what that sacrifice actually is. Is it a propitiation? Is it a thanksgiving? Is it something that you're offering just because it's a routine thing that you're offering, right? Is it a sacrifice, right? I think a lot of people, again, coming back to that mentality of, is it right or wrong, right? People say, oh, I have to give this particular thing. And at that point, if they're doing it just because they have to, then it's not a true offering, right? There's a difference between offerings and sacrifices, right? There's this idea that, you go out of your way when you can to actually give something from the heart, or give something to show your dedication or to show your respect. It's about respect, right?
Yeah.
I remember there was a conversation happening, I can't even remember where now, but it was essentially someone asked the same thing, and she works with Bridget. And she's vegetarian, but some of the books say you should give, I think it was give her lamb or something like that. Give her something that this person wouldn't normally buy, right?
Right.
And she was asking, will Bridget be angry over that? I said, well, there's a difference between you offering it because you can't have it versus you going out of your way because you can't have it to get it for her.
Right.
Right. If you give somebody something because, well, you can't have it, it'd be like table scraps.
Right.
Versus going out of your way because you can't have it, but still going out of your way to get it and take it, procure it for that spirit, right? So in that way, it's showing respect. It's showing understanding that their needs are being catered to instead of your own, right? It's removing this idea that, oh, well, this is all just symbolic and it doesn't really matter, I'm just like lip service, right? That's when it becomes unhealthy. When it becomes unhealthy, you're just doing it in order to get something, right? If that's not part of the relationship that you have with that being, or a part of the contract with that being, because contracting is a big one too, right? Then it's like, well, what you're just showing up,
right.
And
I think that gets back to, what are you doing regularly, and making the effort is just like in any other relationship you have. If you don't make an effort to be actively interested in another person and their needs and how they perceive your behaviors, and you don't know what other people are going through. I had a disagreement with someone, and I used a curse word, which in my universe, not a big deal. And he reacted really strongly to it and said, long ago, I was in a situation where that kind of language was violent. And so I was like, thank you so much for telling me. It's no big deal to me, which I was not understanding how my words were hitting you. And so
Yes.
in that way, it gets back to not using symbols that would be interpreted differently and thinking. It's taking your time and energy to think about who you're communicating with. And that's what builds any healthy relationship, right?
Exactly. This is the thing. And I think cornerstone to that really is that you are communicating with something or someone.
Right.
Right. I really push this idea because in the Western world, again, we have this sense that, all of this is archetypal, all of this is just metaphor, all of this is real. And I've experienced the opposite. I think a lot of people have experienced the opposite, right? So if you're basing your practices off of, again, this routine of, well, I have to do it because I have to do it, but it doesn't really matter. Like there's nothing really there. It's just a form of story that I'm telling, right? It's just a form of practice, right? Then you might as well just stop, right? And we see this in the other cultures. Certainly most of the other cultures definitely have that realism piece there.
Right.
To the extent that one of the big warnings in Lakumi is when you receive your orishas, or when you initiate and you begin to receive your own vessels of these spirits, right? Offering to them, giving them candy or sweets, particularly like Elegua, for example, who is the spirit of the crossroads and the doorway openings, and he's the little mound with the cowrie eyes that you sometimes see in the cult shops. Love Elegua. But he gets used to things. So if you're giving him sweets in order for him to help you with things in your life, and you make it routine, then he's going to continue to expect that from you over and over and over and over again. And if you stop, he will get angry and upset and he won't help you anymore.
Right.
And so it's like that piece around, like, what do you, like that routine piece, again, you have to be very intentional with that, right?
Right. Well, yeah. And being mindful is kind of the idea behind folkloring is
exactly.
You have to be able to incorporate it into your life. Not that it has to be no effort, but it's finding that balance of, mindfully making sure that you're thinking about the ancestors and you're thinking about how you are communicating. And I think that, again, it just gets back to deciding what it is, where you're going to put your effort. And it can be, you've given some examples even in your book of different, small things that you can do every day to maintain that. And I don't know if you can think of any examples of like something that either you do or an example you gave in your book of something that you can do on a regular basis that is meaningful, but can be fit into a life where people have jobs and kids and.
Well, so, okay. So let's look at it this way, right? Folklore culture evolved in a way because it was needed, it was necessary, right? So we live in a very different lifestyle than 200 years ago, when a lot of like the kind of folk traditions that we work with in our field, right, evolved and started up, right? There was a need to propitiate God and thank God for the harvest yield, go to the church and take crumbs of wafer to spread on the field, right? There was a need for that because you needed this food to survive, right? There was a need to thank the spirit of the hearth for continuing the fire to for you that you needed to stay warm on cold winter nights, right? There was a need for all of these folk practices, and the spirits connected with them all. We live in a different lifestyle now. So it's how do you bridge that lifestyle to those needs? So it could be something simple in a spiritual sense of sitting in your car every morning and thanking the spirit of the car for continuing to run without issue, right? It can be something as simple as when you're cutting something out of your garden or going to the grocery store and getting vegetables, just saying to yourself, thank you for this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
As simple as that, right? It can be something as simple as, like, there's so many things. For example, what I do is every single night before I go to bed, I look up at the light that's coming in from the street outside, and I say, here we are again. Because that light coming in through has always been there throughout my life, and that's like my wind down time. So the spirit of the fluorescent lighting from the outside, right, is my way of connecting. Here we are again, another day gone, have a good night. right?
Right. I think about how our environment defines our daily habits. Like
Very much
when I
so.
go to bed, there's a little park across the street from me, and then a larger road beyond that. And there's sort of an optical illusion where when the cars are driving down the large street, and I see them sort of go between the houses that are just down the block from me, it looks like the cars are up high, like on the second.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
just
Yeah.
this weird little optical illusion. And
Yeah.
but I'm the only one that ever sees it. I've lived in my house
Right.
for over 20 years, and I observe that. And it's like this little sort of ritual to myself where, as I'm going to bed, I look for cars going by. And I kind of chuckle to myself. And
Right.
so, yeah. And, but I think you're right in your thinking of, looking around yourself and your life for those moments where you can connect with spirit and with ancestors.
This is the thing. And people do this regardless of if they think of it this way. If you ask any sports fan why they need to wear their special socks,
Yep.
and you will be told, I need to wear my special socks because my team won't win if I don't. I need to do this. I need to do this, right?
Yep.
So the same thing. It's a routine thing. It isn't a separation. I think when you start to begin to see your life in this way and you practice in this way,
Right.
you begin to see that there is no spiritual practice. There's just living.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
That's essentially it,
Wow. Well, I think we're going to have to end there because I know I'm not going to say anything more brilliant than that. So we talked earlier about how people could find your book.
Yes.
But how can people find you? Because you are obviously much more than just an author.
Yeah. So benstimpson.com has everything. I have a Patreon, which has a class. I offer classes on various topics related to therapy, connected to history and folklore, and connected to spiritual practice. That's all on there too. I do have a podcast where I have interviewed all sorts of other pagan authors and folklorists as well. I have my website with all of the different professional services I have on there. And also I have social media too. So Instagram, Facebook, it's all on there. So benstimpson.com.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there any final thoughts that you want to share with listeners?
Oh, I would say that this sense of ancestor veneration being a particular thing is really a Western concept, right? It's something that has evolved because we don't have those things. We have those things, but I think that a lot of people need to, I don't want to say get over your religious trauma, but understand how you already have these rituals and traditions and these things in your life that you can take ownership of and use them to build relationship with your ancestors, however way you choose to define ancestry, right? I think that we have a really abundant cultural tradition and set of cultural traditions that are ripe for us to reconnect with. And I really do think that that's important to reconnect, while also knowing that in that reconnection, we're carrying that forward and changing it to fit our needs for the future.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me.
That's lovely. Thank you, Tracy.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.